unauthorized arrests and fabricated cases.
Without any sanction, people are imprisoned for weeks and months.
Public humiliations in courts.
The newly minted criminal Irina, born in 1998, her surname speaks for itself, Navalnaya.
Show trials with far-fetched charges.
They were accused of terrorism, attack on the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic, and preparation for terrorism.
Cruel torture and extortion of confessions.
They used an electric shock in the colony. She was beaten and bruised all over her body.
Burning to death in Russian pretrial detention centers.
All the ribs were broken and he died from pain shock.
And unjustifiably harsh sentences.
Imprisonment for 16 years in a strict regime penal colony.
The Russian justice has turned into a punitive monster under the control of its dictator. Military, civilians and any Ukrainians who resist Russian aggression become a prisoner of an inhuman regime after falling into the clutches of the Kremlin. Everything about the cynical and targeted massacre of Ukrainian citizens in a special report, Kremlin's Justice. How the Russian courts have become a tool of reprisals against Ukrainians. Cynical show trials, fabricated cases and torture in pretrial detention centers even before the verdict. Since the occupation of Ukrainian territories in 2014, the Russian judicial system, which for decades served the interests of the Kremlin dictator and accused the critics of Putin's regime, has become a tool of repression against Ukrainians. Hundreds of criminal cases under the so-called examination in Russian courts and the courts of the occupied territories of Ukraine. The accused are Ukrainian prisoners of war and peaceful civilians. From 16 to 24 years, these are the terms requested by the Russian prosecutor's office for the 23 prisoners from Ukraine on the trial in Rostov-on-Don. This is one of the most cynical trials taking place in Russia, the so-called Azov case. The Russian Federation has organized a show trial on the servicemen who came out of Azovstal. They were promised honorable captivity under international guarantees. Instead, the soldiers, including medics, drivers, and even cooks, are being tried under trumped-up cases about an attempt to seize power by force and terrorism. In reality, they are on trial for belonging to Azov, which the Russian Supreme Court has declared a terrorist organization. The unlawful show trials has been ongoing since June 2023. In addition to fictitious cases, some of the investigative activities were held without the participation of lawyers. Moreover, neither representatives of human rights organizations, Ukrainian lawyers, nor relatives were allowed to attend the trial. The families monitor the court proceeding through Russian news.
They were charged of terrorism, attack on the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic, and preparation for terrorism. But we could not understand how the DPR could already be in Mariupol. This was all farce.
20 years in a Russian prison for espionage, Kremlin Tatar Linia Umerova is waiting for her trial on trumped-up cases in Moscow's Lefortovo pretrial detention center. In December 2022, while going to visit her ill father in occupied Crimea with Ukrainian passport, she was arrested in the Russian-Georgian border.
She's a civilian who had a legitimate purpose to visit. Even following the Russian law, she had a legitimate right and legitimate purpose for her visit. So everything that happened next was just revenge for her civic position, her refusal in 2014 to get a Russian passport.
More than 20 months in the pretrial detention center, several extensions of arrest and change of investigators. The court has to start in autumn in Moscow.
The case is classified, no circumstances are reported, non-disclosure of information is given by the lawyers. No one is allowed to attend her except lawyers and employees of the Federal Service of Execution of Punishments.
7 years in general regime colony and a fine of 50,000 rubles. This is the verdict that the city court of Feodosia in occupied Crimea made for Irina Danovich, a civilian journalist. She covered politically motivated trials in the occupied peninsula. She was detained in December 2022 at a bus stop.
Evidence from the video cameras where she was standing was found. She was detained by unknown men in a car wearing clothes that looked like representatives of Russian security services.
A case of possession of an explosive device was fabricated against Irina. After an appeal, the sentence was reduced by 7 months. Since August 2023, she has been in a women's colony in Zelenokamsk, Stavropol Krai.
They could only affirm insanction for possession of explosives. They found that her small handbag contained elements that looked like explosives.
20 years in prison just for a surname. Mariupol resident Irina Navalnaya was detained in February 2022. She was accused of planning to blow up the Mariupol district administration building during the so-called referendum on September 27, 2022.
The newly minted criminal Irina, born in 1998, her surname speaks for itself, Navalnaya.
Irina's bicycle became the main evidence in the made-up case against the woman.
The most interesting thing is they don't even remember the color. They probably noticed that the same girl was riding there and they just stopped her to check the documents.
At first, her surname caught their attention as it was the same as the Russian oppositionist. Then they found out that her stepfather is a prisoner of war, Vladimir Stolar. The law enforcers falsified the case and the Russian propaganda claims that the girl is a terrorist.
She was detained, her backpack was checked, she was put in a detention bus. They put a remote control in her back and when the special forces team arrived, they handcuffed her. They shook out the bag and the remote fell out of it.
This woman was to be the executor of a terrible crime. The suspect was on a bicycle and took dangerous goods to one of the administration offices in Mariupol.
Ukrainian Artem Baranov is serving a sentence under the trumped-up article for espionage. He is a former police officer from now-occupied Novakhovka. He was kidnapped by the Russian military from his own apartment in August 2022. Before that, he refused to become a collaborator to cooperate with the occupation administration.
I was told, be thankful that he was not shot. He is a traitor, he was sending some geolocations, she sent some data somewhere. He's facing 20 years in prison.
A criminal case was initiated only 7 months after his arrest. Artem was sent to the Rostov pretrial detention center. After being sentenced for espionage, he was sent to the Bataisk colony for 10.5 years. This is how criminal cases against Ukrainians are fabricated in Russia and sent to the courts. The Russian Federation is violating the norms of international humanitarian law. The military, according to the Geneva Conventions, have a special status, combatants. Participating in an armed conflict or resisting the aggressor is not something that can be tried. Non-combatant civilians who are listed as members of the armed forces but are not taking part in hostilities cannot be prosecuted either. These are medics, supply workers, cooks and priests. It is forbidden to detain or interfere with their work. They must be released unconditionally. Moreover, torture, hostage taking and humiliation against peaceful citizens are unacceptable, and treatment must be consistent with the principles of humanity. Russia ignores all the principles, committing war crimes against all categories of captives.
Совершая военные преступления против всех категорий пленных.
The trials of the Ukrainians are only the tip of the iceberg. During the detention in Russian prisons and detention centers, prisoners are beaten and tortured, and medical assistance is denied. The conditions of the Russian horror captivity while waiting for the verdict caused the death of one of the Azov prisoners, Alexander Ishenko.
I was informed that it was the heart attack, but in the conclusion there was nothing written about it. But after a forensic examination in Ukraine, the ground disappeared from under my feet.
Alexander was an engine driver on a merchant ship for 20 years. He was in his hometown Mariupol when the war started. At the age of 53, he decided to defend Ukraine from Russian aggression as part of the Azov Brigade.
Patriot with a capital letter. I don't even know what he loved more, me, our family, or Ukraine. Even in his letters he wrote, "It's the only way I would have done it. I did everything right." I saw him for the last time on March the 12th, 2022.
Alexander was among the military who came out of the besieged Azovstal. For a long time after that, his family did not know where he was.
Then someone said that he was in the Donetsk Remont prison. It turned out that he had been there for 13 months. There were creepy stories were told by those who were exchanged. They said that Alexander got the second heart attack there. The first one he had in 2019. He spent a year recovering.
In June 2023, Alexander and other military and civilians from Azovstal were transported to Rostov for the so-called trial.
There were 8 women of them who were cooks and medics at Azovstal. Our sailing guys from the Azov were transported to Rostov for the trial, for a show.
Alexander's relatives barely recognized him in the photos from the initial court session.
Alexander always weighed 92-95 kilograms, but he weighed 50 kilos there.
The family followed each session. They communicated with each other through letters sent by the lawyer.
There were tribunals once a month, every 2 weeks. These trials. They were sitting in a glass cage. They all had lawyers appointed. They still being tried. We saw how he changed from thin to overgrown with sore demise.
The lawyer told his family about the attitude of security guards towards prisoners.
When they were taken to the court and people wanted to stretch all body muscles, they always beat them, tortured, beat until they bled. They were constantly beaten by the guards.
On July 22nd, 2024, Alexander was beaten so badly that he eventually died.
Some paramedic came and examined him, but he left, and the ambulance came 3 or 4 hours later. If they'd provided assistance, he would have still been alive. But they didn't want to. They left him.
Olena got the Russians' forensics experts' report. They tried to hide the real cause of death of the Ukrainian serviceman. It was established when Alexander's body was transported to Ukraine.
The cause of death was undetermined. In Ukraine, the real cause of death, blunt force trauma of the chest. All the ribs were broken. He died from pain shock.
The conditions of detention in Moscow's Lefortovo have also undermined Lenya Umerova's health.
In the last letter, which we got on August 5th, my sister complained of a worsening of her condition. She had undergone analysis which showed that her blood iron was low and she was prescribed certain medication, which unfortunately can only be bought in Russia and somehow given to her. But these drugs are not provided there for her.
Irina Danilovich is also on the verge of death because of inhuman treatment. According to the information of human rights activists, she was facing severe otitis and stroke. It could have been the result of torture and beatings, which she claimed at court hearings.
We know that she is not receiving medical care. No medication is given and her health condition is only getting worse. The medicines that were given by relatives were not all reached and not always. The medicines that were provided didn't have the same effect and were not directed at the treatment that was prescribed for her.
Irina Navalnaya also faced torture in the pretrial detention center. A confession of guilt was beaten out of her. The lawyer demanded an investigation of girls' torture, but to no avail.
My daughter was beaten everywhere except her face. Her skin was covered in bruises. There are testimonies from one of the exchange girls who was with my daughter in the cell. They were really afraid for her health because she was covered in bruises. She was tortured with electric shock. Everything but her face.
Artem Baranov was also subject to torture and humiliation during his detention.
He wrote in one letter that there was torture every single day. He was tortured with electric shock. There was always reception. It is when you are beaten, interrogated and forced to learn Russian songs, Russian anthem. They were taken to the showers once a week, where they were standing on their knees. If someone was beaten and started screaming, then everyone was beaten.
Artem's wife saw the consequences of torture with her own eyes.
He had handcuff marks on his hands. It was a month after the detention and the scars remained. There was fungus on his hands. He said that it was since the cell was small and they kept 20 people there. They didn't take them outside, the room was not ventilated. They were not allowed to shower, so the problems with their hands began.
Международная гуманитарная
International humanitarian law, which requires human treatment of all prisoners, have always been a dead letter for the Kremlin. Inhuman treatment and permissiveness towards Ukrainian prisoners are already traditional practices for the Russian judicial and prison systems. They are now linked together and serve the same purpose: to punish anyone chosen as a victim as strictly as possible.
жестко наказать любого, кто избран жертвой.
The Russian Federation put its judicial system on a war footing back in 2014, when it occupied Crimea and started the war in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. At the same time, the first punitive trials against patriotic Ukrainians on falsified charges began in the occupied territories. In occupied Crimea, the Kremlin authorities began to persecute Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars for their resistance to Russian and occupied authorities, for rallies near the building of the Crimean parliament, and for protests on the so-called administrative border.
On May 3rd, at the border near Armyansk, many hundreds of people met Mustafa Jamilev, who was not allowed back into Crimea. In order to be allowed back, a huge number of people went on protests. We were allowed back in, but then there was a flurry of administrative cases, fines were imposed, and we started gathering money, thousands of rubles.
Later, the deputy chairman of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, Niman Jalal, was convicted under the article of the Criminal Code. The case against him was fabricated for organizing the explosion of a gas pipeline in the village of Perevalovo. He was detained right after returning from a meeting of the Crimean Platform, which is seeking ways of deoccupation and returning Crimea occupied by Russia to Ukraine.
My visit to the Crimean Platform is not the only reason, but the final piece, because of which this avalanche has already derailed. The avalanche of revenge from the occupation authorities' side. It touched me and several other people who were also arrested in this case, like Hassan and Aziz Akhtemov.
The court sentenced Niman Jalal to 17 years of imprisonment in a strict regime colony. He returned to Ukraine in a prisoner exchange. After the full-scale invasion, Crimean Tatar detention centers became reception centers for prisoners from the newly Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories.
There were guys from Luhansk, from Kherson, our citizens who get into these unofficial places of detention in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk regions. They face incomprehensible and inadequate cruelty. Those who officially pass through some kind of court cases like sabotage, terrorism, and attempt on someone's life. Cases that have been created in a vacuum.
The article for discrediting the Russian army appeared in March 2022, and the occupation authorities predicted that the population may not perceive the so-called special military operation and there will be resistance. So they introduced this article. More than 120 cases on the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea.
Ukrainians are now being detained en masse with the new explanation for opposing the so-called special military operation. They are being illegally detained without charges, investigations, or courts.
They have coined the term that doesn't exist in any Russian law: detained for opposing a special military operation. On the basis of this detention, without a court decision, without any authorization, people are detained for weeks and months, and some for years. Absolutely no one has access to those people, only representatives of the Ministry of Defense, military police and Russian special services.
Since 2014, the occupied peninsula has become a territory for testing the mechanisms of reprisals against activists, journalists, and critics of the Russian and occupation administrations and those who oppose the war.
Up to date, we have more than 218 Crimean political prisoners in places of detention in temporarily occupied Crimea and on the territory of Russian Federation. More than 130 are representatives of the Crimean Tatar people. And this number continues to grow.
Since 2023, 2 political prisoners have died in Russian detention: Konstantin Shirin and Jamil Gafarov, Crimean political prisoners who were convicted, who had a number of chronic diseases. The Russian authorities and the medical service at these prisons, including the heads of these colonies, knew very well that people were sick. They denied medical care to these political prisoners.
All these repressive measures are aimed at intimidating pro-Ukrainian people living in Crimea or other temporarily occupied territories.
The scale of illegal trials and falsification of cases against Ukrainian civilians is shocking. According to the head of Russian Intelligence Committee, Alexander Bastrykin, Russia has launched more than 4,000 criminal cases against Ukrainian servicemen since 2014. More than 200 have been sentenced to long prison terms, including lifelong imprisonment. Russian Federation denies criminal cases and trials on civilians. According to human rights defenders, in more than 2.5 years of full-scale invasion, there are no known acquittals of prisoners of war and Ukrainian civilians in cases made up against them.
The repressive conveyor is started, where investigators, prosecutors, judges, everyone is interested in getting a criminal case heard and a sentence passed. Their promotion, new stars on epaulets, new titles depend on it.
It is impossible to determine how many Ukrainian military and civilian prisoners of the Kremlin are in the pretrial detention centers and prisons in Russia, including the occupied territories. According to estimates by the Office of the Ukrainian Parliamentary Commissioner for Human Rights, 38,000 Ukrainians remained missing during the Russian war against Ukraine waged by Putin. More than 14,000 are civilians who may be in Russian captivity, and this number is not final. Russia is deliberately concealing the number of captives to prevent the exchange and return of Ukrainians to their homeland.
The International Criminal Court and the International Tribunal on Russian Aggression, which is currently being set up, should have such defendants. Russian investigators who falsified these cases, Russian prosecutors who are obliged to oversee the rule of law, and Russian judges who pass such unlawful verdicts. We have massive war crimes and crimes against humanity. For the whole world, not only for Ukraine, this is a huge challenge. It must end so that other dictators will not be allowed to repeat this Russian way. Certainly there will be many trials, there will be many defendants, and many will be convicted.
Ukrainian prisoners have become hostages of the Kremlin regime, while Russia has no right to judge Ukrainian citizens captured during the war. Neither the military, who stood up in defense of their state, nor civilians. Creation of cynical, illegal and show trials, fabricated criminal cases, violation of the principles of fair trial, egregious sentences, as well as torture and inhuman treatment of both prisoners of war and civilians are gross violations of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. In other words, those are war crimes, which are recorded by both human rights defenders and international organizations. And Russia will have to pay for it. Ольга Михайлюк, Наталя Гусак, Special Report.